The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was filled to capacity that Tuesday afternoon. Every seat was occupied by reporters, staffers, and onlookers who sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Stephen Miller, former senior advisor to Donald Trump and architect of several controversial immigration policies, sat at the witness table, jaw tight, eyes scanning the committee like a hawk surveying its territory. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas adjusted her microphone. Her posture was composed, but her expression carried a clear determination. Within the next 30 minutes, Miller would interrupt her 6 times, each interruption sharper than the last. But it was Crockett's 7th statement, measured and precise, that would silence him completely and shift the tone of the entire hearing. Within minutes, the exchange went viral, garnering millions of views and sparking a national debate about respect, authority, and who truly shapes the political conversation in Washington. Before diving into this powerful confrontation that captured the nation's attention, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our detailed coverage of pivotal political moments. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We appreciate hearing from engaged citizens across the country who care about truth and accountability and to understand why this moment became so explosive. It's important to know who these two figures are and why their clash was almost inevitable from the moment Miller took his seat. At 38, Stephen Miller had built his entire career around being the unyielding voice of hardline immigration policy. As Trump's senior advisor and chief speechwriter, he helped design some of the most controversial measures of that administration, including the family separation policy at the border and the travel ban targeting Muslim-majority nations. Known in Washington for his combative nature and unrelenting debating style, Miller was rarely caught off guard. He had faced senators, journalists, and critics with the same method, speaking quickly, dominating conversations, and never admitting fault. Facing him was Representative Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who had quickly earned a reputation as one of the sharpest and most fearless questioners in Congress. At 42, Crockett brought both courtroom skill and moral conviction. A former civil rights attorney and public defender, she was experienced in handling hostile witnesses. She also understood what it meant to fight harder to be heard, a perspective shaped by her background and the communities she served. Her district covered parts of Dallas and nearby suburbs, areas deeply affected by the immigration policies Miller had helped craft. The hearing stakes could not have been higher. The Judiciary Committee was examining the long-term consequences of Trump-era immigration actions, particularly the family separation policy that tore thousands of children from their parents at the southern border. Recently released documents revealed that officials were aware of the emotional and psychological harm it would cause but chose to proceed anyway. Miller had been summoned to testify about his role in creating and implementing those directives. For Miller, this hearing was about protecting his reputation and defending policies he continued to view as essential for national security. He came prepared with statistics, rehearsed talking points, and his trademark combative confidence. To him, this was another opportunity to justify his version of immigration reform, rooted in deterrence and strict enforcement. For Crockett, however, the issue was deeply personal. She had toured detention centers, met with separated families, and witnessed firsthand the trauma inflicted on children. And as a Black woman in Congress, she also recognized a familiar dynamic: being talked over, interrupted, or dismissed by powerful men. She had encountered figures like Miller throughout her career, those who mistook aggression for authority and interruption for intellect. The committee room radiated tension. Behind Miller sat his legal team and advisors, all in dark suits with serious expressions. Behind Crockett, her staff sat alongside immigration advocates, some of whom had personally suffered under Miller's policies. A few wore shirts bearing images of separated families. Major news networks interrupted their regular programming to cover the hearing live, cameras capturing every detail. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan brought the session to order promptly at 2:01 p.m., though maintaining decorum proved difficult amid the packed audience. Members were ready. Democrats prepared to press Miller on his record. Republicans prepared to defend him and shift focus to current border challenges. But everyone knew the most anticipated exchange would come between Miller and Crockett. For the first 20 minutes, tension built. Several Democrats had questioned Miller, but he handled each encounter predictably, dodging questions, talking over opponents, and reverting to rehearsed defenses. Republican members offered friendly questions, allowing him to reinforce his stance as a misunderstood patriot. None had managed to pierce his defenses. Then, Chairman Jordan announced, "The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room fell silent. Cameras zoomed in. Crockett leaned toward her microphone, her tone steady and confident. "Mr. Miller," she began. "Thank you for being here today," Crockett began. "I'd like to start with a straightforward question. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy caused documented psychological harm to thousands of children?" Miller's reply came instantly, his words sharp and quick. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was about border security." Before he could continue, Crockett interjected, "Mr. Miller," but he talked over her. "The real trauma," he pressed on, "comes from human traffickers exploiting these children and from prior administration's policies that encouraged illegal crossings." Crockett raised her voice slightly, still composed. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking about the specific documented trauma." Miller interrupted again, leaning toward his microphone, his tone rising. "The documentation you're referencing comes from biased sources that ignore the broader context." "Mr. Miller," Crockett said firmly, "this is my time, and I would appreciate—" He cut in again, voice firm. "The border crisis was created by years of failed policies that President Trump and I were trying to fix." "People like you," murmurs rippled through the gallery. Chairman Jordan gave a half-hearted tap of his gavel. "The witness will allow the member to ask her questions." Miller leaned back slightly, his jaw tight, eyes locked on Crockett. She stayed calm, flipping through her papers as though his interruptions were mere distractions. "Mr. Miller," she resumed, "I have here a memo from your own Department of Health and Human Services, stating that family separation would cause, and I quote, significant and lasting psychological damage to children. This is your administration's assessment. Do you dispute this?" Miller launched into another deflection. "What I dispute is the idea that we didn't care about children, when in fact, the memo clearly states—" Crockett tried to continue, but Miller pressed on. "The Obama administration built the cages. They separated families too. They just didn't admit that real border enforcement requires tough decisions." The crowd grew restless. Several Democratic members shook their heads. Even some Republicans appeared uneasy at Miller's aggressive tone. Crockett remained composed, jotting notes on her pad as Miller continued his lengthy monologue. When he finally paused, she spoke quickly. "Mr. Miller, I understand you have your talking points, but I'm referring to documents from your administration." Miller nearly shouted his response. "My administration? My administration saved lives. We stopped child trafficking that you seem to ignore." Crockett turned to the chairman. "Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that the witness be reminded to allow me to use my time to ask questions." Jordan tapped his gavel again, weakly. "Mr. Miller, please let the Congresswoman ask her questions." Miller sat back, face flushed, gripping the edge of the table. The atmosphere was tense. Cameras clicked rapidly, and journalists tweeted updates in real time. Crockett met his gaze, her tone steady as steel. "Mr. Miller, I've been a civil rights attorney. I've been a public defender. I've stood in courtrooms across this country, and I have never—" Miller interrupted again, leaning forward with a smirk. "Your courtroom experience doesn't qualify you to speak on national security or border enforcement, Congresswoman. The reality is, but this time, Crockett didn't interrupt or appeal to the chairman. She simply sat back, arms crossed, and waited. Miller continued for nearly 30 seconds, his voice echoing through the chamber as he ranted about border policy, trafficking, and so-called democratic failures. When he finally stopped, perhaps expecting another challenge, Crockett stayed silent. 1 beat, 2 beats. The silence was thick, almost tangible. Every person in the room leaned forward. Then she spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, carrying a weight that commanded attention. The room was so quiet that even the hum of the air conditioning was audible. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she leaned forward, hands folded neatly on the desk, her gaze locked on Stephen Miller with an intensity that made several people in the gallery hold their breath. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice calm but firm, carrying clearly across the room. "You've interrupted me 6 times now. 6 times you've shown this committee, the American people watching, and everyone here exactly who you are." Miller started to reply, but Crockett raised a single finger, and something in her expression made him stop. "You see," she continued, her voice steady but growing stronger, "men like you have been interrupting women like me all our lives. You interrupt because you believe your voice matters more. You interrupt because you think loudness equals authority. You interrupt because deep down, you know that if you had to answer my questions honestly, if you had to face the evidence of the harm you caused to thousands of children, your carefully built narrative would collapse like a house of cards in a storm." The room fell silent. Miller's face went from red to pale. His lawyers sat frozen, unsure whether to intervene. Crockett began pulling document after document from her folder, placing them neatly on the table as she spoke. "Let me explain what these papers actually say, Mr. Miller, since you've made it difficult for me to question you properly. This memo from your deputy at Health and Human Services confirms that children as young as 8 months old were separated from their mothers. 8 months old. This report from your own Customs and Border Protection shows there was no system in place to reunite families. None. And this email chain, which includes your name, shows you dismissing psychological concerns because, and I quote, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations." She paused, looking directly at him. Miller gripped the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mouth moved, but no words came out. "Other considerations," Crockett repeated quietly, her tone low but cutting. "Those other considerations were children, Mr. Miller. Babies, toddlers, kids who will carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. And you knew it. You all knew it. And you did it anyway." The gallery erupted. Some people wept. Others nodded in agreement. Chairman Jordan banged his gavel, calling for order. But Crockett wasn't finished. "What truly matters, Mr. Miller," she continued, her voice now stronger, "is that you can interrupt me, talk over me, try to belittle me. But I am still here. Those children are still suffering. Those families remain broken. And you're still responsible." She leaned forward, eyes fixed on him, and delivered the line that would soon go viral. "You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller, but you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your actions. Interrupting me 6 times won't change the fact that history has already judged you and found you lacking. Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were taken from. And no amount of interruptions will ever drown that out." The room exploded with noise. Miller's face turned ghostly white. His mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. For the first time in his public career, Stephen Miller was completely speechless. His attorneys whispered frantically, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on Crockett, a mix of disbelief and unease in his eyes. The gallery was in chaos. People stood and applauded. Reporters typed furiously, and the C-SPAN camera zoomed in on Miller's expression, capturing his stunned silence. Chairman Jordan pounded his gavel again, shouting for order, but his voice was drowned out by the commotion. Several Democratic members stood and clapped, and even a few Republicans appeared unsettled by the exchange. Crockett sat still, hands folded, her face calm. She had used only 3 of her 5 allotted minutes. But she was done. She had said everything that needed to be said. When quiet finally returned, Chairman Jordan asked softly, "Mr. Miller, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's statements?" Miller leaned toward his microphone. His voice, when it came, was hoarse and uncertain, a far cry from the assertive tone he had carried all day. I stand by the policies of the Trump administration. We were protecting America." The words fell flat. Everyone in the room could hear the weakness. Miller knew it too. The man who built his reputation on dominance and control had just been dismantled by a freshman congresswoman from Texas. Crockett's closing words were simple but final. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, "I yield back the balance of my time. Mr. Miller's silence speaks louder than anything else." As she yielded back, the silence in the room said more than any words could. Then, something remarkable happened. Members of the gallery began to stand and applaud. It wasn't the loud, frenzied applause heard earlier, but a slow, deliberate clapping that spread steadily through the room. Even a few Republicans on the committee shifted uneasily, avoiding Miller's gaze. Miller sat motionless at the witness table, his once organized notes scattered in front of him, completely forgotten. His team of lawyers and advisors behind him looked equally shocked. They had prepared him for every possible line of questioning and every potential attack on his record. But they hadn't prepared for this, for Crockett to turn his own interruptions and hostility into evidence of his character, delivering a calm, decisive takedown that left him with no path to recover. The silence stretched on, heavy with tension. Miller's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass, nearly knocking it over. The man who once stood at the White House podium, defending the indefensible with unwavering confidence, now looked like he wished to disappear. Representative Ted Lieu, next in line for questioning, leaned toward his microphone and said simply, "Mr. Chairman, I think Ms. Crockett has said everything that needs to be said. I yield my time." One by one, other Democratic members followed suit. It was unheard of, each member giving up their time to question one of the most controversial figures of the Trump administration. But they understood that nothing they could add would carry more weight than what had just unfolded. Each yielding of time chipped away at what was left of Miller's composure. By the time Chairman Jim Jordan called for a recess, Miller looked like a boxer still standing only because he hadn't yet realized the fight was over. As the room began to clear, he remained seated, staring blankly at the table. His team surrounded him, whispering reassurances he barely seemed to hear. In just 3 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done what years of criticism, protests, and media scrutiny had failed to do. She had stripped away the facade of righteousness Miller had built around himself, exposing the cruelty behind his policies. Within minutes, video clips began to spread online. "Crockett destroys Miller" was trending worldwide. Her piercing line, "Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from," was shared millions of times, turned into memes and painted on protest signs. But inside that hearing room, there was only silence. Stephen Miller, the architect of family separation, and a man who had never met a microphone he couldn't dominate, now sat defeated, while Jasmine Crockett calmly gathered her papers and walked out, head held high. The ripple effect of Crockett's exchange spread rapidly through Washington and across the nation. Within an hour, the video had surpassed 10 million views across social media platforms. Major news outlets interrupted regular programming to replay the moment. Political commentators from both sides agreed that something extraordinary had just taken place. On CNN, Anderson Cooper led his broadcast with the full 3-minute exchange, played without interruption. "In my 20 years covering politics," Cooper said afterward, "I've never seen anything quite like what we just witnessed." The famously unflappable Stephen Miller, known for his combative style and refusal to back down, had been rendered speechless by Representative Crockett's composed but devastating response. Even conservative networks struggled to defend him. On Fox News, Tucker Carlson admitted, "Miller walked into a trap today. He should have just let her ask her questions." Laura Ingraham attempted to shift the conversation toward current border issues, but her guests kept returning to the viral moment. Meanwhile, on MSNBC, Joy Reid was elated. "This is what happens when you try to bulldoze a black woman who came prepared with receipts," she said. Jasmine Crockett didn't just shut down Stephen Miller today. She exposed the weakness of bullies who mistake interruption for intellect. The political world reacted swiftly. Former President Barack Obama tweeted, "Representative our Jasmine Crockett TX showed us what grace under pressure looks like today." More importantly, she reminded us that the voices of those hurt by cruel policies will not be silenced. President Biden released a statement through the White House. Today's hearing highlighted the lasting wounds caused by the previous administration's family separation policy. Representative Crockett's powerful words remind us why such cruelty must never happen again. As expected, Donald Trump rushed to defend Miller on Truth Social, writing, "Stephen Miller was ambushed by a radical left Democrat who doesn't understand border security. He was fighting for America while she was grandstanding for cameras." Witch hunt continues. Yet even his defense lacked its usual intensity. Perhaps more telling was the silence from Miller's usual allies. Senator Ted Cruz, typically quick to defend Trump officials, said only, "I didn't watch the hearing. I was focused on border security legislation." Senator Marco Rubio told reporters, "Everyone needs to lower the temperature and focus on solutions." Their muted responses spoke volumes. In the hours after the hearing, Crockett's office was inundated with messages of support. Her social media following skyrocketed by more than 500,000 in a single day. Invitations poured in from every major news outlet, but she declined most of them, agreeing to appear only once on PBS NewsHour, where she chose to discuss the substance of immigration reform rather than the viral moment itself. Without the hype or theatrics, Crockett made her stance clear. "This isn't about me versus Stephen Miller," she told PBS's Omni Noaz that evening. "It's about accountability for policies that hurt thousands of children." She explained that Miller tried to make the exchange personal, focusing on interruption and dominance rather than the issue itself. "The American people deserve more than political theater," she said firmly. "They deserve the truth, and the truth is, these policies were intentionally cruel. Those who designed them must take responsibility." Meanwhile, Miller's team went into full damage control. They released a statement claiming he had been ambushed, and that Crockett was using national security for political gain. The statement came across as defensive and unconvincing. Miller himself remained unusually silent, even canceling a scheduled appearance on Sean Hannity's show that night. Behind closed doors, frustration grew within Republican circles. Several GOP members of the Judiciary Committee expressed disappointment in Miller's behavior. "He made us all look bad," one Republican told Politico anonymously. "You can't just talk over people in a hearing." Crockett handled him with precision. He walked straight into it. The immigration advocacy community immediately seized the moment. Groups that had long opposed family separation policies now had a new rallying cry. Crockett's 7th line from the hearing was printed on T-shirts, painted on protest signs, and turned into a viral hashtag. Families once separated at the border began sharing their experiences again, empowered. By seeing a member of Congress finally hold Miller accountable public legal experts soon weighed in on the evidence Crockett presented. Many of the documents she cited, which had received little prior attention, clearly demonstrated that the administration knew about the psychological harm its policies would cause, and continued anyway. Several former prosecutors noted that this documentation could strengthen ongoing lawsuits filed by affected families. Representative Crockett's approach was brilliant. From a legal perspective, said constitutional law scholar Lawrence, she didn't just expose Miller publicly, she entered critical evidence into the congressional record. His inability to refute it served as an implicit admission. That will matter in court. The cultural effect was just as profound. The exchange became a teaching example about power, interruption, and respect. Women's rights organizations pointed to the hearing as a textbook case of how interruption can be used to assert dominance, and how women can push back effectively. The hashtag #LetHerSpeak gained momentum, with thousands of women sharing stories of being interrupted or dismissed in professional spaces. Corporate diversity and inclusion programs began using the hearing footage in workshops. "This is what we mean when we talk about microaggressions turning into macroaggressions," explained Dr. Kenji Yoshino, director of the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at NYU Law. Miller's interruptions weren't just rude. They were an attempt to undermine a congresswoman's legitimate authority. Crockett's response should be mandatory viewing for anyone studying power dynamics. Within a week, the long-term political consequences became apparent. Miller's standing in conservative circles had suffered greatly. Several Republican candidates quietly backed away from seeking his endorsement, and his once high speaking fees evaporated as event organizers distanced themselves from the controversy. More significantly, the family separation policy, once fading from public attention, returned to national focus. The Biden administration responded by announcing renewed efforts to reunite separated families. Congress began debating compensation for those affected and measures to prevent such policies from ever being reinstated. Crockett used her rising profile wisely. She avoided grandstanding, keeping her focus on tangible policy reform. She introduced the Family Protection Act, which banned family separation at the border, except in verified cases of abuse or trafficking. The bill received bipartisan support, with several Republicans joining as co-sponsors to move beyond the legacy of the previous administration's policy. She also began mentoring young women entering public life, especially women of color. Speaking at a leadership conference in Houston, Crockett told a group of young Black women, "What happened in that hearing wasn't just about me and Stephen Miller. It was about every woman who's ever been told to be quiet, to wait her turn, or to let the men speak. You don't have to accept that. You deserve to be heard, respected, and empowered to hold the powerful accountable." The moment also reignited national scrutiny of the Trump administration's immigration record. Journalists filed new Freedom of Information Act requests inspired by the evidence Crockett revealed, leading to fresh disclosures. Whistleblowers stepped forward with additional details on how the family separation strategy was developed and executed. 3 months later, the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General released a detailed report confirming much of what Crockett had presented. It found that officials, including Miller, were repeatedly warned about the psychological damage caused by separating families, but continued regardless, viewing the trauma as part of a deterrent strategy. Miller attempted a comeback through an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, defending his record and accusing Crockett of chasing viral fame over border security. The piece fell flat, drawing criticism for its defensive tone, and for sidestepping the factual evidence she had entered into the record. A year later, the exchange was still being analyzed and discussed. It was featured in a documentary on U.S. immigration policy, with interviews from Crockett and several families who had been directly affected by the separation policy. The legacy of that moment extended far beyond politics. It reshaped public conversation on power, accountability, and compassion in governance. Miller declined to participate. The documentary went on to win several awards and reignited attention on the ongoing trauma endured by separated families. Political science professors soon began using the exchange as a teaching case. It's a clear example of how preparation, composure, and moral conviction can overcome aggression and interruption, said Dr. Jennifer Lawless of the University of Virginia. Crockett didn't try to outshout Miller or match his hostility. Instead, she used his own behavior to strengthen her argument and present a moral stance that rose above politics. The ripple effect spread in unexpected directions. In several later congressional hearings, witnesses attempted Miller's style of aggressive interruption, only to be swiftly stopped by committee members referencing the Crockett-Miller exchange. "We're not doing Miller interruptions here," became a frequent remark from chairs when sessions grew heated. Across different industries, women began sharing their own Crockett moments, instances where they turned interruption and disrespect into opportunities to display competence and resolve. The term "pulling a Crockett" entered the political lexicon, meaning to calmly turn an opponent's aggression against them. For Stephen Miller, the damage to his reputation proved permanent. Though a loyal base insisted he'd been unfairly treated, his influence in mainstream conservative politics never fully returned. His appearances were limited to friendly podcasts and small right-wing gatherings. The man who once shaped national policy from the White House had been pushed to the margins of political relevance. Defined by the moment a freshman, Congresswoman rendered him speechless. Legal repercussions also continued. Several lawsuits from separated families cited the hearing transcripts, especially Crockett's presentation of documents showing the administration's awareness of the psychological harm their policies caused. In a landmark ruling, A federal judge referenced the hearing while determining that the government owed damages to affected families, writing, "As Representative Crockett powerfully demonstrated, the cruelty was not accidental, it was deliberate." 2 years after the hearing, Crockett released her book, Uninterrupted, Speaking Truth to Power in America, which became a bestseller. The chapter recounting the Miller exchange was the most discussed. "That moment wasn't scripted," she wrote. "I had questions prepared, and I had my documents. But when Stephen Miller interrupted me for the 6th time, something became clear. His interruptions weren't just disrespectful to me. They represented how his policies had interrupted the lives of thousands of families. Children torn from their childhoods, parents interrupted from their duty to protect, entire communities disrupted by fear and trauma. When I finally spoke, I wasn't just speaking for myself. I spoke for every child who cried themselves to sleep in detention, wondering where their parents were. For every parent whose child was taken from their arms. For everyone told their pain didn't matter, their voice was irrelevant, and their humanity was expendable." Miller thought his interruptions could silence me. Instead, they became evidence of his guilt, not just in that hearing room, but in history. Because men like him never understand. You can interrupt our words, but you can't interrupt our truth. You can speak over us, but you can't silence justice. You can dominate a moment, but you can't suppress accountability forever. Her book tour reignited focus on immigration reform and elevated her national profile. Speculation about her political future grew. Talk of a Senate run or higher office circulated widely. She deflected such questions, saying simply, "I'm focused on the job Texans sent me to do. If I do that well, the future will take care of itself." Meanwhile, the broader impact on political discourse deepened. The Crockett-Miller exchange became shorthand for a new kind of accountability, one rooted not in matching aggression, but in responding with facts, calmness, and moral clarity. Political consultants urged clients to study her approach. The old strategy of dominating and interrupting doesn't work when your opponent knows how to turn it against you, one Republican strategist told Politico. Crockett proved that preparation and composure always outmatch bluster. In journalism schools, professors used the exchange to show how political theater can be transformed into meaningful accountability. Crockett didn't just create a viral moment, said Columbia Journalism School's Emily Bell. She used Miller's conduct to expose the cruelty of his policies. That's sophisticated communication that transcends partisanship. The emotional impact on separated families was perhaps the most profound. Many said they felt a sense of validation they had never known. Seeing him finally held accountable, "It was healing," said Maria Santos, whose son was taken from her at the border when he was 3. "For so long it felt like no one in power cared about us. Representative Crockett made us feel seen and heard." Support groups began showing clips from the hearing as part of therapy for parents and children. Psychologists observed that witnessing accountability, even symbolically, helped families process their trauma. "It's not legal justice," said Dr. Louise Zass, who treated separated children, "but seeing someone powerful recognize their suffering has real therapeutic value." 3 years later, the hearing's legacy remained powerful. Crockett's line, "Your legacy isn't strength. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from," became one of the most quoted statements in modern political history. It appeared on memorials, in academic works, and in political speeches denouncing family separation policies. By then, Crockett had become one of the Democratic Party's most sought-after speakers, yet she stayed committed to policy work. She passed multiple bills on immigration reform and child welfare, often saying, "Every bill I write, every speech I give, I think of those children. They deserve better. We all do." Miller, meanwhile, retreated from public life. Attempts to rebuild his image through op-eds and interviews failed. The image of him sitting silent before Crockett became his enduring public identity. Every analysis of his career mentioned that moment as the point where his influence collapsed. The broader message for American democracy was unmistakable. Preparation. Truth and moral clarity can still overcome aggression and cruelty. In an age often defined by political theater and noise, Jasmine Crockett proved that substance and integrity still matter. Her calm, determined response became a blueprint for holding power. Accountable, the story of how Jasmine Crockett turned 6 interruptions into her opponents. Undoing has evolved into more than a viral event. It's a lesson in leadership. What made her response effective wasn't only her words, but her self-control and her ability to turn disrespect into exposure of moral failure. She didn't outshout him. She let his conduct speak for itself, then connected it to the suffering caused by his policies. The 7 statements that reshaped the moment were her initial question about documented trauma, her attempt to cite specific memos, her request for basic respect of her time, her reference to HHS documents, her mention of her civil rights background, her silent patience through his 6th interruption, and finally the line that ended his credibility. Your legacy isn't strength, Mr. Miller. It's the sound of children crying for parents they were torn away from. For anyone facing a Stephen Miller, someone who confuses loudness with logic, Crockett's example offers a roadmap. Don't meet aggression with aggression. Let their conduct reveal their character, then answer with calm, informed truth. The ripple continues across politics and culture. Young professionals study the exchange as a model for handling disrespect. Law schools use it as a case study in witness control. Political scientists cite it as a turning point in effective congressional oversight. Most importantly, the families affected finally heard someone say what they had waited years to hear: that what happened to them was wrong, intentional and inhumane. Crockett didn't just defeat Miller in a viral moment. She gave a voice to the silenced, dignity to the dehumanized, and hope to the forgotten. In an era where noise often drowns truth, her triumph reminds us that preparation and composure can still prevail. It proves that bullies, no matter their power, fall when confronted with unwavering truth. As America continues to reckon with the legacy of family separation and strives toward justice, the lesson from that day remains clear. Those who interrupt to avoid accountability will eventually be interrupted by the truth. And when that happens, all their noise collapses under the weight of moral clarity. If you found this deep dive insightful, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more thoughtful analysis of moments that shape democracy. Share this video with others who believe in truth and accountability. Comment below with your thoughts. What other moments should we examine next? Remember, in the fight for truth and justice, every voice matters. The real question is, will we use ours as powerfully as Jasmine Crockett did that day? The choice is ours. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never let anyone interrupt your truth.